Hi. So it's been 10 months since my last video, but I promised myself that when I finish university, and indeed I did, I graduated, I was gonna fucking finish the critique of pure reason. That's what I'm doing. Probably gonna see here the structure of the critique and everything that we've done so far. We left it at a very important stage in the critique, which is schematism. We've already done the transcendental aesthetic, we've done the transcendental logic, we've done the transcendental deduction, and we've proved that the categories are indeed necessary and they have objective validity. And now we're just gonna move on to how do they actually get applied onto objects of experience. But first of all, I'm going to do a recap because I feel like we need a recap. It's been a long time. So, recap. The Critique of Pure Reason was published amidst a battle between two different philosophical currents. One of them was British empiricism, which defends that everything that we know we get from experience. The most famous philosophers were Locke, Hume, and all the British empiricists. That was kind of in a beef with German rationalism, which says the opposite. So reason gives you substantial knowledge, independent of experience. And here we've got Leibniz, we've got Spinoza, and all the German rationalists. In a very simplistic way, Kant is in the middle of these two currents. So he's in the middle between empiricism because he thinks that experience is important to some extent. It is important in order to get knowledge, and believes that there's some a priori knowledge that we can't get from experience. What Kant inherits from rationalism is that experience cannot reveal strict necessity. Some knowledge is a priori. Some structures of knowledge are ingrained in, let's say, our brain or in how we see things, and they don't necessarily come from experience. For example, the truth of geometry or the truth of mathematics. And he also inherits that the mind gives structure to our experience. Experience is not something that is fully absolute and it's the same for every kind of being. Humans with our minds adapt the experience to our human structures. But then Kant also rejects some stuff from rationalism, which is that reason is everything. With reason, you can go anywhere. For Kant, this is not the case. So reason alone can't reveal ultimate reality. And then Kant asks himself this question: if experience cannot give you absolute truths, but also you can't get absolute truths without experience, how can metaphysics be possible? What counts as metaphysical knowledge? Can we actually have something known as metaphysical knowledge? And as we saw in the preface, metaphysics cannot be merely empirical because experience cannot reveal necessity. And we can see this with the example of Hume's famous ball. You may see that ball A moved because ball B moved it. So after B moved, A moved, but we can't be sure that that will happen again. With that particular experience, we cannot extrapolate that that's going to happen again and again and again. We can discover causality just because we saw it an X amount of times. So experience cannot give you a necessity. And then metaphysics cannot be just purely analytic because analyticity, which we explained in another video, does not really give you any new knowledge. It's like me saying all bachelors are a merit. The predicate is already in the subject, is basically what the definition of a bachelor is. So Kant concludes that metaphysics therefore requires judgments that are both a priori, because they need to be necessary and universal. Otherwise, what kind of science is that? What kind of metaphysical knowledge would that be if it's not necessary and universal? And synthetic, because it has to give you new knowledge. And this is the birth of synthetic a priori knowledge or synthetic a priori judgments. An example being a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, which later on with non-Euclidean geometry is proved to be wrong sometimes, but for the practical purposes of the video, that would be a synthetic a priori judgment. So all of this was very revolutionary, and this is what we know as Kant-Copernican revolution, because before we thought that our cognition adapts to objects to get to know them, but now is our mind that adapt objects of experience for them to be cognized by us. And he famously says, objects, insofar as they are objects of possible experience, must conform to the conditions of our cognition. Then in a different video, in the following video, I talked about transcendental aesthetic, which is the answer to the question of, okay, so if the structures of a mind are able to cognate objects of experience, how do we get to know that? What is the medium by which we cognate objects? Kant's answer is by the forms of intuition, which is space and time. Space and time are the canvas of everything. through space and through time, that's how we're able to get to know the objects of experience. So those are the canvas that makes cognition possible. And then in another video, very long and hard and horrible, because it was very hard to read, we get into the transcendental logic, which is, okay, so space and time are the canvas. Now, what are the tools our mind uses to make sense of the objects that we see through space and time, which are the categories of the understanding? And there's 12 in total, like unity, plurality, substance, causality. So those don't exist in things by themselves. They make sensory experience intelligible for us. Without them, we would not make sense of objects. We also briefly talked about the difference between the phenomena and the noumena. Phenomena being the objects as we perceive them, how we see them, how we perceive them, and the noumena, how the objects are in themselves. So independent of human cognition. And we will never be able to know the noumena, obviously, because we are enclosed in our human structures. So what was the purpose of the critique? Very briefly, as stated in the B preface, Kant asked, why is metaphysics not yet a science? Things like logic, areas like mathematics, are stable. They have stable methods. They have progress. We've gone from discovering algebra to complex calculus. Now, metaphysics feels like it hasn't been able to agree with all the different currents and all the different trends of thought that have gone through the ages. Constant fighting, basically. We have rationalism against empiricism. It is not accumulative. We have not been able to make knowledge progress the same way logic and mathematics have been able to. And there's completely contradictory trends like theism and atheism. And Kant answers that metaphysics has been this way because we have not been able to do a prior critical inquiry into whether reason was entitled to make the claims metaphysics was traditionally making. So maybe we are trying to do too much into discovering whether God exists or doesn't exist, or there's like a superior energy that creates all this prior first mover, like Aristotle said. Kant considers that we're going too far. There's limits to reason. So the critique of pure reason is an audit of reason. We're not here to prove God's existence or not existence. We need to establish first what reason can know and what can't know, and how we can know it. You have the famous quote at the beginning of the critique where Kant says, I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. God cannot be theoretically known. However, very important as well for Kant, even though there are things that reason cannot achieve and we can't get knowledge of certain things, he detaches himself from the rationalist trend by saying that all knowledge begins with experience. So without experience, we will not be able to get any of this knowledge. But then how a priori judgments, a priori knowledge can exist if we need knowledge in order to get it? It's not that mathematics didn't exist before we saw them or before we encountered a mathematical problem. A priori knowledge existed within us, but experience awakens that knowledge. Experience wakes up these cognitive capacities that we already had inside us. Then I made a video about the transcendental logic, which is the categories, as I have explained earlier. And the transcendental logic is divided into the metaphysical deduction, where Kant derives a table of categories. First derives a table of judgments, which are kind of like the atoms of how we understand things, the little chunks of how we structure any kind of like knowledge or beginning of the understanding of something. And then from judgments, which is the base of our understanding, we derive the categories. So for example, I could say all dogs are mammals. That would be a judgment that I can make, and that would lead into the category of universality, like something that's universal. All X are Y's. Or for example, I could say there is one dog in the room. That's a judgment that I can make. That is related to the category of unity. Only one. It's not plural. It's a unity. Also can't explain how we get to unite the categories and objects of experience by introducing a concept of synthesis. So synthesis is the bridge between sensibility, so what we perceive, the colors, the shape, the textures, all of that, which is the manifold, which is all this sensible experience, all this empirical matter that we still don't make sense of. And then using synthesis, we create our unity that then is able to be cognated by the categories. So with synthesis, the imagination and the role of the imagination, that gives us a unified representation which leads to eventually cognition. Synthesis can be empirical. I can see leaves green, a log, brown, and there will be a tree. And synthesis can be pure. For example, I can have 7 and I can have 5, and then the result will be 12. I didn't have to see anything in order to get to that conclusion. But that's a synthetic, unified representation I did in my mind. And finally, my last video was about the transcendental deduction, which was horrible. It was fascinating, but it was very hard to make because the transcendental deduction is very hard to understand. There's multiple scholarly debates about what Kant actually meant, and I tried to do my best. If you want to have a look at it, you're more than welcome. But the transcendental deduction is answering the question of why must every possible object of human experience conforms to the categories? Why every time we see something, we can apply the categories to them? How is that possible? In short, Kant made some sort of argument that says that experience is only possible if 1, intuitions are synthesized. Otherwise, if we don't have a unified representation of something, we are never going to be able to understand what we're looking at. So intuitions are synthesized, but that synthesis requires understanding. Otherwise, we will not do a synthesis without the understanding. Then 3, understanding can only operate with the categories. Therefore 4, every possible object of experience must conform to the categories. Otherwise, we would not understand anything, or we would not have any experience at all. So without the categories, there will be no objects for us at all. So the transcendental deduction proved that the object validity of the categories of the understanding. Okay, so where I left it is the analytic of principles. So in this place, we're going to have things like the second analogy and the axioms and very famous arguments that Kant makes. So here he asks himself, if the categories are pure concepts and they have objective validity, now how can we explain the mechanism by which they get applied to sensible objects? What is the mechanism by which this happens? So this mechanism by which categories are applied is what we call schematism. But wait a moment, didn't I just said, or the deduction said, that the imagination is what bridges sensibility and the understanding? Wouldn't that be the answer? And yes, to some extent, the imagination takes the manifold to make them a unified experience that we can cognate with the understanding. This distinction between the imagination and the schematism is a purely classification one, because the imagination is the faculty that allows this mediation, and the schematism is the procedure by which imagination mediates between them. So I made a really horrible drawing on my notes, as you can see here. I don't know if you can see it, but I will try to draw it here. So the big circle will be schematism, which is the whole mechanism. Then you've got the imagination as a procedure, which is inside schematism, and then the schema, which is the rule that we apply, we're going to talk about that in a second, is inside the imagination. So schematism is a very short chapter. I think it's around 12 pages. It's definitely no more than 15 pages. But it is extremely important. It's going to be about how do we get to apply the categories on objects of experience. This is how Kant presents the problem, which is at B171. He says, the analytic of principles will therefore be a canon solely for judgment, instructing it how to apply to appearances the concepts of understanding which contain the condition for a priori rules. For this reason, while adopting as my theme the principles of the understanding, strictly so called, I shall employ the title Doctrine of Judgment as more accurately indicating the nature of our task. So the question to start the chapter would be something like this. If we have the category of causality and the object of the experience we attach to it, and we know this category, just like the others, have objective validity on the object of experience, how can we be 100% sure that we have applied this category correctly? What allows an abstract category, like causality, to determine a concrete, sensible event? And as we know, pure categories are devoid of space and time, because they are not in experience, they come from us. So are we going to bridge them with sensory experience, which needs space and time? This is a question that Kant has as well, and he talks about it in the name of transcendental judgment, or the power of judgment, which is the cognitive faculty that links abstract concepts to sensory experience. In the same page, Kant says, if understanding in general is to be viewed as the faculty of rules, judgment will be the faculty of subsuming under rules, that is, of distinguishing whether something does or does not stand under a given rule. So judgment is the application of the understanding. This is what's going to help us in this chapter, judgment. However, neither general logic or anything else, for that matter, can give you the rules of judgment. You don't learn these rules of judgment by doing logic or by studying the rules. It's just something that comes from us. In fact, I'm going to go on a tangent here, but Kant says that you can't effectively learn judgment, saying that judgment is a peculiar talent which can be practiced only and cannot be taught. And the people that do not have judgment are stupid. He calls it stupidity. Even though you may be knowledgeable and you may be very well read, you may still be stupid because you lack this judgment. The rules that allow you to apply the understanding the categories onto things properly. And according to him, and this is quite funny, it is very hard to get out of stupidity, because even though someone can teach you how to use judgment, we still do not have the judgment to apply the rules of judgment. So we end up in this circular vicious cycle. So basically for Kant, if you are stupid, you may remain stupid. Okay, end of tangent. Let's get into schematism properly. Do you remember when at the beginning of the critique, Kant says that concepts without content are empty and content without concepts are blind? He starts his schematism with something similar, with this quote: "The concept must contain something which is represented in the object that is to be subsumed under it." So the category has to refer to an object, the object has to refer to some category. That is the analogy that we will make, right? Contents and concepts, categories and objects. But the problem is that categories are a little bit different than just mere concepts. For example, if I see a cup and from there I get the concept of cup, my understanding creates the concept of a cup. We have intuited that with sense and appearance. But when I see that ball A pushes ball B, we cannot intuit through sense and appearance that is causality event, that one thing caused the other. We don't really see that. We can't really apply the same analogy in this case, because categories can't literally empirically refer to an object. At B177, Kant says, obviously there must be some third thing which is homogeneous on the one hand with the category and on the other hand with the appearance, and which thus makes the application of the former to the latter possible. This mediating representation must be pure, that is, void of all empirical content, and yet at the same time, while it must in one respect be intellectual, it must in another be sensible. Such a representation is a transcendental schema. So again, schematism, what mediates between the categories and the objects. As a simple definition, simple, not necessarily 100% accurate, but a schema is a rule that we learn that helps us identify categories and objects. In order to understand this a little bit more, this bridge of schematism, category, and object, I read an article by Jonathan Bennett that I would link in the description that makes things a little bit clearer on what Kant means by this. In his article, he says that instead of associating each concept with a single image, like we did with content and concept, or with a set of exactly similar images, Kant's theory associates each concept with a rule. Kant knew that it's very naive to think that we are able to just emerge these rules and the categories from just purely seeing one event coming after the other. It's just simply too far-fetched. But he was not the only one that talked about this, because previously Locke and Hume, another empiricist, had this idea of an idea that comes from empirical objects. For example, Locke said that we get the idea of a dog by looking at all sorts of different dogs with similar characteristics. So we get a vague idea of what a dog is. But again, Kant thought, well, this presents sort of problems. There may be very different types of dogs that are completely different, like a Chihuahua and a German Shepherd. So if we want to include all of these types of dogs into the idea of dog, that idea is going to be very vague and indeterminate, to the point that we're not going to be able to distinguish it from a fox or from any other sort of mammal. And that is the problem that Kant identified. You can't just say, oh yeah, this category of causality is applied when you see one ball hitting another ball, because that's quite vague and indeterminate. You can't really apply it directly. It's not that straightforward. Bennett also says, Kant avoids this impasse by associating each concept with a rule. For a rule can be specific enough to create only images of dogs, while being complex enough to allow any detailed image of any particular kind of dog. So a rule is more complex and more accurate than just images. And I think that Bennett explained this quite well. So moving on, the first time he introduces the concept of a schema is, I think, B178, B178. And then he calls it this mediator between the categories and the objects. And it is a bit confusing it was confusing to me at least. So I'm going to read it and then we're going to try to understand what it means. So he says, B178, the concept of understanding contains pure synthetic unity of the manifold in general. Time, as the formal condition of the manifold of inner sense, and therefore of the connection of all representations, contains an a priori manifold in pure intuition. Now, a transcendental determination of time is so far homogeneous with the category which constitutes its unity in that it is universal and rests upon an a priori rule. But on the other hand, it is so far homogeneous with appearance in that time is contained in every empirical representation of the manifold. Thus, an application of the category to appearances becomes possible by means of the transcendental determination of time, which, as the schema of the concepts of understanding, mediates the subsumption of the appearances under the category. Whoa, can't just stop. What I take from this extract is that what unites the categories and the objects is this schema, these rules that we apply to it, but then these rules are under time. So the categories become schematized within time, and then this way, in the same canvas, they're able to apply to objects. So the answer is time. Everything that we do with the understanding happens in time because it allows everything in the inner sense to happen. Time becomes all the connections of all these representations, as he says, because it is always present. So schemas are inherently temporal. They've got to be temporal. If you think about causality, without time, causality wouldn't make any sense because we know something caused another thing because time has happened and you give it time for it to happen, right? For ball B to move after ball A moved. So this temporal schema is what allows us to get this rule of causality. It's complex, a little bit confusing as well, because it feels like Kant is making schemas be equal to time, but it's not exactly equal to time. And it's quite a debate whether he means just a temporal schema or something different. What we get for sure is that he is saying that categories, in order to cling themselves to objects of experience, they need some sort of empirical content, otherwise it wouldn't make sense. And that happens through the intuition of time. It's got to happen through time. We need time for it to be given to us. The example that I've already explained, the category will be causality, that's the category. Then the schema would be one event follows another in time according to a rule, and then the appearance would be this lets us experience one event as causing another. And then he starts talking about all these different schemas. For example, time itself is the general form in which all appearances occur, but then we've got the schema of causality, as we just said, succession in time according to a rule. We've got the schema of substance, which is permanence in time. What is a substance if not something that perseveres in time, right? And then we have the schema of necessity, which is existence of all time. And again, as you can see, time is in every single definition. But again, I do not think that Kant is saying that schema is equal to time. Time is what's making the mediation possible, but the schema is the category specific way time is structured. It is a product of the imagination. So as a recap, categories reside in the understanding, and in the understanding they don't have any space or time, they just exist independently of space and time. But the moment we use them for cognition of objects of experience, they become temporally schematized somehow. So we have pure categories, which are the categories in general, and then we have the schematized categories, which is categories together with their empirical content. And again, it's very difficult to actually point exactly at what Kant is trying to say with a schema, but scholars, much more intelligent with much more experience than I do, debate whether schema is more like a procedural rule or like a temporal determination happening in time. But it's definitely something that allows the categories to become empirical friendly, so they can apply to objects of experience. Let's continue with the examples. In this chapter, he also makes a distinction between an image and a schemata, which is the plural of schema. For Kant, according to him, an image is a concrete snapshot of something. So for example, an image would be a specific 5 dots that I make on a piece of paper, that I draw on a piece of paper, or a particular triangle that I see or I draw. A schema, however, is not a picture, it's not an image, it's a rule, a procedure that lets you generate or recognize instances. In this particular example of drawing 5 dots, the image is me drawing 5 dots. The schema would be the rule for successfully adding 5 dots in a certain amount of time, in time. It doesn't have to necessarily be a particular number. If I take the example of a triangle, the image would be this particular triangle. The the schema would be the general rule for constructing a three-sided figure in space. So when you are imagining a triangle of 5 dots, that is an image. But the schema is the underlying temporal rule that makes counting or drawing that triangle possible at all. So for Kant, it is the schemata, and not images, which underlie our pure sensible objects. At B180, he says, this schematism of our understanding, in its application to appearances and their mere form, is an art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly likely ever to allow us to discover, and to have open to our gaze. This much only we can assert. The image is a product of the empirical faculty of a reproductive imagination. The schema of sensible objects, such as figures in space, is a product and, as it were, a monogram of pure a priori imagination, through which, and in accordance with which, images themselves first become possible. So first is the schema, then the image. These images can be connected with the concept only by means of the schema to which they belong. In simple terms, without the schema of triangle as a three-sided shape, humans would have never been able to identify a triangle. A triangle is not just 3 lines on a piece of paper. It's this schema, this rule of constructing a triangle to actually know what a triangle is. We could see a three-sided shape, but we would not have been able to put it under the concept of triangle. The most striking thing about this quote that I just read is when he says that schematism is an art concealed in our soul. And the scholar Jonathan Bennett, which I cited previously, also thought that that quote was very particular and very interesting because that's vocabulary that Kant hasn't used before. Art, concealed, so it's hidden, is something that we can't really get around very accurately. So I agree with Bennett that this inspires little confidence, that particular sentence, and also I agree with Bennett on the fact that Kant has not been able to be very detailed about how we come to apply these rules yet. Do we just do it automatically then? So this schema is just the magical rule that we apply in time, and then that's just the bridge between the categories and the objects. It feels like it's quite vague. He just gave a name to it and that's it. Also, Bennett points out in his paper that the existence of schematas are very circular themselves, because if a schema is a rule for generating an appropriate image, then following the rule and recognizing the image already presuppose our ability to apply concepts. The explanation is therefore circular. So there's some problems in there that we still haven't resolved. Kant really doesn't specify anymore, and he goes on talking about more different types of schemas. The most important out of B184 would be possibly the schema of magnitude, which is the one that concerns with numbers. He says that the schema of magnitude is the generation synthesis of time itself in the successive apprehension of the object. And then after all of these definitions, he brings a conclusion at B1A5, and he says, the schemata of the pure concept of understanding are thus the true and sole conditions under which these concepts obtain relation to objects and so possess significance. It's how they get meaning, how the categories get meaning using this schemata. In the end, therefore, the categories have no other possible employment than the empirical. He's also saying here that the categories can only be applied to appearances and to things that are empirical, again mentioning that categories cannot be applied to things in themselves. And I thought that was interesting on its own, how categories cannot be applied to things in themselves, because he's given a restriction to them. Schematism both enables objective experience by giving the categories temporal content, but also restricts it because temporal content only ever applied to appearances. Because according to Kant, space and time are not properties of things in themselves. At least we are not sure about that. We can't know. Kant says that it doesn't, but it's just something that we will not be able to know. So he puts that quite simply and quite well in. So cognition of categories requires sensory intuition, and because things in themselves cannot be sensed, then categories cannot cognize things in themselves. And that is really it. That's schematism. Kant doesn't really say anything else about it, so now we can just debate about different possibilities of what he actually meant. To me, the most interesting point is the last point, that categories can only apply to appearances and not things in themselves. And I wanted to go a little bit further into that topic, and I wanted to put out to you this question. If the categories are conditions under which a specifically human cognition or understanding experiences the objective world, human objective world, what would experience be for another creature that's not human, whose cognitive architecture differs from ours? Would they experience objects or causality of substance at all, or unity or plurality? I went digging and I discovered the marvelous reign of animal cognition. So I thought, imagine a dog looking at a tree, my dog looking at a tree, and then imagine a human looking at a tree. A human would receive different sensations, right? Would receive the color, the texture. According to Kant, our understanding synthesizes the empirical matter, gives a synthesized unity, and that allows us to experience the tree. But then using these schemas, we will be able to argue as well and to realize there's one tree, thanks to the category of unity. If there were 3 trees, that would be plurality, because there will be more than one tree. If that tree persists through time, we will be able to apply a scheme of substance to that tree. And if that tree causes another thing to happen, then we would apply a schema of causality to it. But then what would the dog experience? What evidence do we have that a dog would see all of these things in their minds? Would they see something completely different? Would they be able to cognize a unity of a tree? Or a plurality of trees? There has been some scholarship written on this matter, and there are roughly 2 different camps in contemporary Kant animal cognition scholarship. One of them is called conceptualist, and the other one is non-conceptualist. The non-conceptualist explains that animals can actually perceive objects, even though they are not able to categorize them into concepts or into categories the same way humans do it, but they still do perceive things like we do. So they have a similar perceptual world, but that precedes or is in an inferior category, on a different kind of like step from our conceptual judgment. And then you have the conceptualist, which states that animals do have sensations, but we don't know what kind of sensations they've got, and they don't experience the objective world the same way we do. Kant doesn't really talk about this issue too much, just different kind of like sentences or different snippets there and there in different books that he wrote. But scholars can only debate about what he could have said about the matter. I read a particularly interesting article by Colin Maclear's Animals and Objectivity, is called, that I will link in the description as well. Maclear defends a non-conceptualist view. So animals do see things like we do, but they don't quite form these concepts. His main question is, if animals don't possess the intellectual capacities that we do, can they nevertheless experience an objective world? According to Maclear, Kant actually does say that animals have sensory representations of their environment, so they do have intuitions, and they are acquainted with objects, but they do not cognize them. For Kant, animals have no judgment or reason. So Maclear starts from the point that animals do have mental representations, according to Kant, but are those representations objective like ours? In Maclear's paper, there are very different definitions of different types of objectivities. So what is methodological objectivity, perspectival objectivity, 7 different types of objectivity. I'm just going to mention a couple of them. One of the important ones is methodological objectivity, that states that humans, when we enter a room and when we look at an open space, we're able to take a step back and to be able to assess what's there, whereas maybe a dog would only be able to see or to perceive whatever is able to continue their existence, or whatever they actually want to look at. Maybe they just look at the squirrel they want to hunt, or they look at the food that they're going to eat. He also talks about perspective objectivity, which is just saying, oh, that thing is there, this thing is here, that thing is there, according to your perspective. He also talks about metaphysical objectivity that both humans and to some extent, I guess, like dogs would have, which is being able to assess that something exists independently of the mind. And then we also have reflective objectivity, which animals definitely don't have, according to Maclear, which is when you understand not only that something is something, but also why that is the case, why something is correct, or why something is the case. After he defines all of these types of objectivity, Maclear applies some Kant theory to what animals could potentially perceive. And as we have seen, we need a unity of apperception in order to cognize anything at all. I'm not able to understand what the number 5 is if I'm not able to remember what 4 is or what 3 is. If I don't have a unity of self-perception of me drawing the previous 4 dots before I get to the 5th dot. And then Maclear asks himself, oh, well, do animals have this unity of perception at all? According to Maclear, Kant would say no. But even if they don't have this unity, can they distinguish things? Seems pretty obvious that they're able to distinguish things, right? At least from a human perspective. Kant distinguishes two different types of cognition. One of them is acquaintance, so that is how we discriminate from one thing to the other, depending on their characteristics. And then proper cognition, which is not only being able to discriminate something, but also understanding why we discriminate it that way. According to Macmillan, a dog has acquaintance, is able to distinguish one thing to the other. A dog would be able to understand, I mean, this probably happened to you. If you have a dog and you give them a very desirable thing for them, maybe a tennis ball, and then you give them something that is definitely not of their interest, they know how to distinguish the thing that they like and the thing that they don't. So they have some sort of acquaintance, but they probably don't have the cognition of having the judgment of saying, oh, this is the thing that I want, and this is something that I don't want because of this, because it's not tasty, because it's not easy to chew. Whatever a dog would think. So they're able to discriminate, but they're not able to cognize. On page 10, Macmillan says, a dog may physically differentiate, but not logically differentiate. So any animal, upon seeing two different things, they're able to go from one thing but not for the other. It is sensitive to the difference, but it cannot form a logical argument about why that is the case, why they picked what they picked. They don't have to cognize the differences, they just physically differentiate. They cannot articulate the basis of this discrimination. But then Macmillan says, if dogs and any sort of animal is able to discriminate, they must have some sort of consciousness, even if they don't have self-consciousness. If they're able to distinguish one thing from the other, they may have some consciousness that decides that thing from the other. And then he says something quite interesting related to how the categories of substance and cause for us humans helps us to understand objects of cognition. For example, I could say that red ball is rolling in the park because someone pushed it. But if we think about this red ball, I may cognize it that way as a human, but a dog would not have that and may think something like red, round, moving. But they will not have the synthesis of apperception that we do have. We organize this red moving park and we put all of these things together into one singular concept, into one singular unity. But a dog may just see different things and never unite them. They would not have that synthesis where we would, and they wouldn't link those properties to the same object. If we push that ball, again, a dog may not be able to identify that was the same ball that he just saw. A dog may not have that cohesion that requires the category of substance and causality. And personally, I think it's quite difficult to prove that indeed animals are able to have this kind of synthesis of our perception. They have this synthesis of properties, at least in the same way as we do. So we get to the end of this Macmillan's paper and we ask ourselves this question, is animal perception objective or not? Macmillan concludes that animals do have perception of external particulars and they are objective, but they see an objective world in a less complex way than we do. They have presentational objectivity because they know where something is, they know that it's independent from them, but they're not able to step back into a bigger picture, or they may not be able to understand why that thing is there or what caused it. They're only directly presented to the things in the world, but they're not able to make claims about those objects and whether things are true or false. So animals are objectively aware of the things in the world, but they don't conceptualize things with the properties and causes. And Macmillan puts it in a very elegant way at the end of the paper by saying that humans and animals are in the same mind-world ladder, but not in the same step of the ladder. So we're kind of here in the ladder and then animals are here. Animals are just not able to conceptualize it the same way we do. And then I was satisfied with that answer, I suppose, without getting into more complex biology. And then I came across with a different article about a 20th century biologist, I think, called Jakob from Uexküll. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. This person suggested a very interesting concept called the concept of the Umwelt, which I did not know about, and I read it in an article from the Philosopher by Team Elmo Feiten. I will link it in the description. And basically the concept of Umwelt is the idea that different organisms inhabit different perceptual worlds, determined partly by the biology and the sensorial and behavioral organization. So different species see the world in completely different ways, whereas the same species see the world in the same way. However, because of behavioral differences or sensory differences, they may have minor differences. But what he's basically saying is every species have a completely different way of looking at the world, but even within humans, we still have different experiences, which is the most interesting part of the article. My experience, the way I look and perceive the world may be different from your way of looking at the world. We may share the same capacities, However, my personal history, my skills, your history, your skills, what I learned to notice versus what you learned to notice when you were a child, that would make our experiences different from each other. And that leads to the very scary point of the article and for Uexküll, which is that my experience is marginally different from your experience, and then I would never be able to completely understand you, to completely understand what you're saying. I would never be able to leave what you leave. So we are sort of in a perceptory and sensory jail where we are never going to be able to understand each other. And with that positive note, I think I'm going to finish this video. I don't know how long this is going to be, but I think doing a video on schematism was necessary. And sorry if I was not very clear. I was trying to be as clear as possible, but Kant is just not very clear in the chapter, unfortunately. If you think that I got something wrong or you've got any questions, please leave a comment because I would like to learn more and I would like to talk to someone about this. It's been a pleasure to be back. Bye.